guns, and money. Send lawyers, guns, and money.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Conduct Detrimental, the Sports Law Podcast. I'm your co-host, Daniel Wallach, the founder of Wallach Legal, LLC, and a legal analyst for The Athletic. Joining me, as always, is sports litigator extraordinaire, Dan Lust. So, Dan, how have you been doing this week? How's the new job going?
New job is good. You know, Dan, I find it so funny in the world of sports law. You never know what you're going to wake up to or go to sleep to. And the last thing, Dan, that I truthfully expected after Major League Baseball got through all of the COVID obstacles, that there would be a positive test that came up during the World Series, and a very big player had to be taken out. So we can, Dan, you and I can have a lot of fun with different stories online. And I know, Dan, during the game last night, you posted that Kevin Cash's Wikipedia page had been changed after he pulled Blake Snell early. And I was having fun, with Kershaw and Betts. But this is all of a sudden in the middle of the World Series, a pretty serious story. So, I think that's something that definitely caught my attention, and why, definitely wanted to talk to you today about it.
Yeah, well, it's been a really interesting year in professional sports, truncated seasons, which ultimately led to short seasons that crowned champions that were not altogether unexpected to be the champions. I think the Dodgers, the Tampa Bay Lightning, and of course, the Los Angeles Lakers, which lends some credence to the legitimacy of the season. There was some question, and I think I had raised the question early on as to whether you can truly equate the champions of this kind of COVID-shortened season with champions that have to endure a full regular season, road trips, 7-game series back and forth between their home venue and the road venue. And I think the results bear out that there's no question these are legitimate champions. And we can try to compare seasons, but I don't think anyone looks to the 1981 Los Angeles Dodgers with an asterisk simply because there were two, half seasons played that didn't add up to 162 games. So I thought it was a really interesting final outcome before we get to, the COVID issue, that, the teams that won were pretty much among the favorites to have won. So it does really, really boost the credibility of each of these leagues and how they've, at least tried their best to create a competitive, albeit shortened season.
Yeah, I definitely hear you. I will say, I guess on a fun note, Dan, I don't know if you saw, I got a quick shout out from Barstool this week. Between you and I think, Dan, we're circling the radars on Barstool. I got the KFC shout out. You got the Massachusetts shout out. I think we're getting there.
Just as they say, a playoff series doesn't truly begin until the home team loses a game. I don't think an interaction with Barstool means anything for either of us unless it's El Presidente or Big Cat.
We're getting there.
Yeah.
You got Erica Nardini, and I got KFC. Those are right in the Mount Rushmore of Barstool.
Yeah, I've been retweeted by Dave Portnoy, but I've never interacted with him. And I think I have an in with the company anyway. When I grew up in East Meadow, Long Island, went to Hofstra Law School, I lived maybe 20, 30 years in East Meadow. And my family's favorite restaurant in the neighborhood was a restaurant called Borelli's, which is like this landmark institution going back to the 1950s. If you go to the Nassau Coliseum for any Islander games or concerts, you eat at Borelli's. And the owner's grandson, Frank Borelli Jr., is now like an emerging personality on Barstool Sports. So we do have between us, we're sort of several peripheries away.
You know what they say,
on Barstool.
Yeah. You know what they say? No one circles the wagons like the Buffalo Bills, but when it comes to this podcast, no one circles Barstool like the Dans. Dan, you ready to jump right into our rundown for today?
Yeah, I think so. It won't be the usual guest episode, but I think we have a few topics that are certainly worthy of consideration. So let's go to it.
Okay, so we'll keep this episode pretty tight. We have 4 topics on the docket. Number 1, we're going to talk, the COVID ramifications of Justin Turner. We'll get into that. And then number 2, a story, Dan, that I know that you're very close to, the New York Mets potential holdup in the sale due to Bill de Blasio, the New York City mayor, trying to trigger a very obscure clause in the Citi Field lease, which definitely gets our attention. And number 3, I know there's a sports betting update. I won't spoil it, but there's an update in a big Wire Act case. And number 4, which, Dan, we spent a lot of time talking about this over the summer and really, over the last maybe a year. But Antonio Brown finally has found a home, but his legal cases are not resolved. So we should definitely unpack that. So with that being said, let's go to number one. Just a quick background, and then, Dan, I'll toss it over to you. Justin Turner, former New York Met, was with the Dodgers for the past couple of years. He's hits in the heart of their lineup. He's their third baseman. The reason it's a sports law story today, we spend so much time talking about COVID, different protocols, Major League Baseball strict compliance with these protocols, how a positive test, had to keep you out for a certain amount of time. But more importantly, Dan, into the heart of this story, that the test results had to come back prior to games in order to avoid a situation where a player who tested positive was actually playing in the game. So what happened here during the second inning of last night's Game 6 of the World Series, which the Dodgers won. And Dan, quick shout out to this hat I have. I have a Giants blue and black hat on, but a little representing Clayton Kershaw, one of my favorite players. It's okay to root for a player on the other team if he's Clayton Kershaw. I think that's legal. But, importantly for the story, in the second inning of last night's game, Major League Baseball hears word that in Monday's testing of Justin Turner, those results didn't come back until during Game 2 of the following day, and those results came back as inconclusive for COVID. So what Major League Baseball did after they heard in the second inning, they said, well, we need an expedited run of his test results from today that he took before the game. So those came back in the seventh inning of the game in which he was pulled. So, it doesn't really end there in terms of just kind of weird situations and decisions. Turner was pulled off the field, taken out of the lineup, and told to stay in the locker room. But within a couple minutes, Dan, Turner's on the field taking pictures without a mask, hugging people, shaking hands. And the players on his team said that Turner's a part of the team. We want him to be a part of the celebration. But that being said, at least I haven't heard in the past couple of days, there's no cure of COVID that is curing someone in 15 minutes. So by all means, I think there is at least a number of bizarre decisions on baseball's part. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the Major League Baseball got through the season with a lot of, issues surrounding the testing and the protocols. But this is really symptomatic of the larger debate that's going on in society where I think, we're letting our guard down and our political leaders are sending mixed messages. So what's taking place on the field, putting aside Major League Baseball's handling of the testing issue, just the notion that Justin Turner is pulled from the game because he's tested positive for COVID-19, and then he doesn't practice social distancing or quarantining himself. He actually goes out onto the field, potentially infecting other players and other players' families and other people that they come into contact with. This is just, we're kind of celebrating the championship, and Justin Turner has a compelling story, basically non-tendered by the New York Mets 7 years ago, and he's made an incredible, second stage of his career. He's one of the core players on the Dodgers. But this is just beyond the pale. But it's not just about Justin Turner. This is happening at political rallies. When we go outside our condominiums or our homes and we engage in the public, there is something less than consistency. So something significantly less than consistency in how people approach the real life and death issue of COVID-19, because I think we've been letting our guard down during a resurgence. And what this represents is a real shortfall or deficiency in not only Major League Baseball's protocols, but their application and how they're implemented, and the lack of accountability from the top down. The team should never have allowed this to happen. And in my opinion, I know they're going to be having a parade and celebrating the championship, but this is a serious issue that I think should face some disciplinary action at the team level, the executive level, and even the player. And I understand Justin Turner's exuberance and desire to share the moment with his teammates. It's been a long time coming. I get that. But that has to be outweighed by the public health considerations.
I'll go one step further, Dan. I had a lot of fun making fun of Rob Manfred last night, who, Dan, I don't know if you caught that. I don't think it's a stretch to say that either Rob Manfred was under some type of substances last night. He was definitely slurring his words, I think, objectively. I don't know what was going on, but I will say this, if we're not going to make accusations that he's, drunk or whatnot, which I don't really.
No, God, no. Not Rob Manfred's kind of a straight arrow type. His problem is he's an attorney and comes across as an attorney too often.
But all I can say is last night, I think objectively, the internet was having a lot of fun. He was definitely affected by something, and his speech wasn't normal. So the only the conclusion that we'll say the Twitterverse or social media is that Rob Manfred realized that he dodged a massive, massive bullet last night. Had the Dodgers not won, right? We can have a whole conversation, Dan, I'm sure, about Blake Snell staying in the game and the Rays winning. Justin Turner was in the clubhouse for 8 innings with COVID playing baseball, right? The situation that we never should have had. But in terms of, Dan, of accountability, right? Like, let's say the Rays won. What would they have done for Game 7? Do they just quarantine everyone for 3 weeks and then they play the game? There's some issues there. But I think, Dan, on a Major League Baseball level, now we're finding out when these tests came in. So the test on Monday, right? I'm not sure when they took the test on Monday, but that was, the day before Game 6. Those results didn't come back until after Game 6 had started. So then you kind of ask, okay, why did that happen, right? Why didn't those test results come back sooner? And then the second question on top of that, Dan, the test results they took that day on Tuesday, those results only came back for Justin Turner because they expedited them, and those only came in the 8th inning. So, I mean, there's no other conclusion as to say that the Dodgers, Major League Baseball, the Rays, they played that game without knowing what the test results were from that particular day. So I think it's not just the Dodgers at fault here. I think it's a fundamental flaw on all of Major League Baseball. At a very high level, I think, Dan, and to your point, they very much took their foot off the pedal. I mean, just because you're in Game 6 of the World Series, it's a deciding game, doesn't mean that you can just stop following COVID protocol. And obviously the season's over. Obviously the season's not in threat, but I can't for the life of me understand how that happened in the biggest moment of the World Series.
Yeah, I mean, you compare the difference between the leagues that played in a bubble versus, football and baseball, where you've had these, multiple positive tests, which have led to either canceled games or canceled practices. There are now going to be maybe suspensions or fines levied at the team level in the National Football League. It really does suggest that I think playing in your home ballpark and trying to have some semblance of or some resemblance to past seasons really does create a significantly heightened risk. And I think basketball and hockey have shown us the way to do it. Unfortunately, football and baseball do not lend themselves as neatly to a bubble environment, given the logistics of the playing surface and the availability of surfaces like that are not nearly as fungible as just putting together a basketball court, and every Gold's Gym has a full court basketball court, but not necessarily an official NFL length football field. So I don't know how they're going to do it during 2021, but I think a lot of introspection. And, I just don't know. I think we understand that there will be a next season, but I think Major League Baseball has to take a hard look at how they want to approach this, because they did dodge a bullet, but we don't know the end of it yet.
No pun intended. They dodged a bullet when the Dodgers won the World Series. Yeah,
and this is the second time the Dodgers have taken advantage of a shortened season to win a championship. 1981, you had the strike shortened season, which created two halves with the winners in both halves qualifying for the playoffs. And now the COVID shortened season has yielded another Los Angeles Dodgers championship season. And there's no question that it's, in my mind, and it doesn't really, I don't think there's any controversy over the crowning of this champion, whether it's in 81 or 2020.
Congrats to Los Angeles on both titles. Just another year of sports now in the books. Okay, so the second topic we wanted to get to today, a big one, Dan. I know you're a very big Mets fan over there. So just a quick background, then Dan, I'll turn it over to you for you're our Mets legal expert, right?
As a Yankees fan, I think I have sufficient arm's length and independence away from the Mets to truly be a legal analyst for the New York Mets. Although I have to admit, full disclosure, I started my fandom as a Mets fan starting in 1970. Of course, I came around 1 year too late. I couldn't enjoy the 1969 amazing Mets championship season. But I was a rabid Mets fan throughout the 1970s until they sold and traded Tom Seaver.
Well, Dan, I know maybe you're not a Mets fan, but I know you're a Steve Cohen fan. So I know this story definitely caught your attention. So Steve Cohen purchased the agreed purchase price of the Mets is a little over $2.4 billion. Even though you can agree on a price, there's still, because Major League Baseball is a very exclusive club, you need to get approved by certain levels within Major League Baseball. So, just to, put a broad brushstroke on it, there are at least two separate levels that the Major League Baseball ownership has to approve of you. So Steve Cohen has got through the first of those levels. The second level and final level is going to occur occur on November 17th. In the interim, there is a bizarre clause in the Citi Field lease. So the New York City, because Citi Field, the Met Stadium, was built on New York City grounds, the city had wanted some say over, some conditions in the lease. So one of those was if the Mets are ever to be sold, that the city and the mayor would have an ability to veto the sale if the sale of the Mets was done to what they called a prohibited person. And under the terms of this lease, it defined a prohibited person as someone that's committed a crime of moral turpitude. So Steve Cohen, as much as we love Steve Cohen, Dan, he does have some skeletons in his closet. The question is whether they're his closet or whether they're his company's closet. Steve Cohen very publicly, his company pled guilty to different white-collar crimes. Steve Cohen never himself pled guilty, but he was kind of indirectly punished, and he had to leave the company as a result. So I don't know if it fits in exactly with the definition of a prohibited person, but it's close enough, Dan, where people have said Bill de Blasio might enforce this, and that's the mayor of New York City. And de Blasio has a 30-day window to enforce this block. And when people said, well, Bill, this isn't really directly a prohibited person because he never pled guilty to a crime, right? It's not like, Dan, like we talked about on social media, like George Steinbrenner, who was convicted of a crime, who does have a crime under his belt. Steve Cohen does not have that. But Bill de Blasio, for whatever reason, is not ruling out that he's going to enact this clause. He says, we're looking into it. The law department's looking into it. We take these very seriously. So, Dan, let me turn it over to you. What do you think about de Blasio's authority and his likelihood of triggering this clause?
Well, first of all, let's hone in on the clause for a second. I mean, prohibited person, it really touches upon 2 points that I think place Steve Cohen really arguably outside the zone of a prohibited person. It doesn't necessarily have to apply to his convictions, his company. He's a control person of his hedge fund. He's the principal owner. And that hedge fund pled guilty to insider trading a few years ago and paid a fine of nearly $2 billion. But just like the term conduct detrimental has been used in an elastic way by the National Football League to cover just about everything, when I think of moral turpitude, you could argue that any crime is one of moral turpitude because you violated the law. You're morally and legally bankrupt. Moral turpitude, I think, has a much more specific meaning than sort of to sweep very broadly and cover everything. And I wouldn't think that insider trading charges, while it's a financial crime, I don't think it fits what would generally be thought of as a crime of moral turpitude. If you think about the reason for a provision like this, it's to keep like bad people, criminals, away from owning teams. And there's a reason for a rule like this and a statutory provision. And say what you want about Steve Cohen's, company, and some of the other allegations that may be floating out there about, workplace conditions. I don't know whether they're true or not. But Steve Cohen is a savior to the New York Mets. I'm serious. Is
that a legal term?
There should have been a clause in this lease that would allow Mayor de Blasio to reject the current ownership because the current ownership is guilty of a similar crime. But
the current ownership agreed to the lease. Though.
Yeah, the crime of egregious mismanagement. This is what Steve Cohen is going to bring to the table. Forget his wealth. At $14.5 billion. He is already 3 times wealthier than the second richest owner in Major League Baseball. But let's look at the good works that he has promised to do upon becoming the Mets owner. Met employees have been taking a salary reduction of between 5% and 30%. Well, those are going to end because Steve Cohen is taking over. He has also agreed to pay seasonal workers who would otherwise be furloughed and not working. He has agreed to pay every single one of them a monthly amount. I don't know if it's $500 or $1,000, but is Mayor de Blasio really going to look the city of New York in the eye and these workers and these employees and object to the deal, maybe to help out his friend Alex Rodriguez and Jennifer Lopez, who he may have, preferred as the ultimate successor owners of the New York Mets? This would just be a bad thing for Mayor de Blasio to do. I don't think he has a legal leg to stand on. And I'd want to know what city attorney from the law department of New York City is going to advise him to block the sale. I want that person to put his name to it, because if Bill de Blasio blocks this sale, good luck trying to find a safe passageway to his gym in Brooklyn. He will be a reviled person in New York, much more than he is already reviled in many circles. He's been largely, and I've been through a number of different mayoral administrations going all the way back to John Lindsay. Take my word for it. He is the worst mayor in the history of New York City. You can't get lower than Mayor de Blasio, but exercising this clause and interfering with a sale that Major League Baseball would have approved, 22 out of 29 owners would have approved, that provides a much needed economic lifeline to a team that has been operated as a third-rate franchise. This is so far beyond the pale that I would expect cooler heads to prevail and the law department to advise Mayor de Blasio that he doesn't have the right to object to this sale because Steve Cohen is not a prohibited person. This is not a crime involving moral turpitude. If this is, then every crime is one of moral turpitude, and the exception swallows up the rule.
So two things, Dan. I will always tell you when I disagree. I think in terms of moral turpitude, crimes involving fraud are probably closer to moral turpitude than speeding or anything like that, or reckless driving. That's just my understanding of, or my view of the word fraud, and insider trading, I think, is close. But Dan, where I do agree with you, and at least is how I read the statute, Steve Cohen, right, himself never pled guilty to anything. It was really the company. Obviously, Steve Cohen is a controlling actor in the company, so you can kind of shoe him in that way. Dan, what I've been alerted to, I'm not necessarily Sir Yacht with my purse sources, but somebody who has been looking into this situation thinks that the brewing legal issue, the one that is maybe explaining why de Blasio is inserting himself in this, it's maybe a delay tactic because there's still a question, Dan, at least as I've been told, as to what will happen with the adjacent surrounding property to Citi Field. The Wilpons have an ownership in some of those stores and some of those properties. And the question, I think, at least as far as I've been advised, what Steve Cohen purchased is still kind of up in the air. Obviously, he purchased the Mets and he can control the Mets and the employment decisions. But the value of this adjacent property, at least as someone who should be in the know told me, is still kind of up in the air. So maybe that's de Blasio doing a favor for the Wilpons and trying to figure that out. But on a legal level, I'm with you, Dan. I don't know what the law department is researching. It's either a question, right? You and Dan, we could look at this for 5 minutes and have an idea of whether or not it's enforceable or not. And then it's a question of whether or not you just want to act on that and make that decision. De Blasio has been asked, probably every day for the last week, are you going to enforce this? And he goes, I'm not sure yet. I'm going to have it decided. The law department's looking into it. It's obviously, whatever Q rating de Blasio has left is being torpedoed and sent to the gutter because he's very much holding the Mets hostage, right? I mean,
he doesn't have to make decisions for political expediency or to satisfy the crowd. I think it's acceptable for him to say that the law department is reviewing the lease. That is a normal statement that I would have expected any mayor to make, because to do otherwise would be to prejudge the situation before you know enough about it to make an informed decision. So far, he's doing.
Maybe on day one that's a response, but day 10, I'm not sure. I don't think that's a valid excuse anymore.
I'd like to hear something more definitive out of him, and I agree with you that we've now reached the point where the Steve Cohen train is gathering, sort of irreversible momentum. It seems pretty apparent that he's going to be cleared and approved by a sufficient number of major league owners. There's no reason to delay this, and to delay it throws into question Cohen's ownership at a time when baseball is about to enter a critical phase of free agency and basically the off the field business of baseball. And to hold up the sale and delay it as we're approaching November, in my view, would be unconscionable. There's no good reason for him to do so. This is the best owner. And the Mets fans are very fortunate here that for the first time in the nearly 60-year history of the franchise, they have a well-heeled owner. They have never had one like this.
So I think we can put a pin in the Mets conversation, Dan, and let's move on to our third topic. Dan, you advised me this one. I watch your Twitter feed pretty closely. And in a case that you've been tracking the sports betting level, we've had an unexpected passing of a judge. Maybe you can fill us in on what's going on there.
Yeah, it's only the biggest gambling case in the federal courts. It holds in its grasp, in some ways, the future of interstate sports betting. It calls into question the legality of all these state-operated lotteries that sell their tickets online or engage in these multi-state lottery pooling of ticket sales. So the Justice Department has interpreted or reinterpreted the Federal Wire Act, which has always been understood as applying only to the interstate transmission of sports bets. The Justice Department has taken an expansive view of this federal law and says that it applies to all forms of gambling, internet poker, iGaming, lotteries. It calls into question the legality of all forms of internet gambling. And the New Hampshire lottery, which is one of the first, I think it's the oldest lottery in the United States that's operated by the state for the benefit of public education. The lottery in New Hampshire brought a lawsuit against the Department of Justice to vacate that opinion on the basis that it's in contravention of the language and legislative history of the Wire Act. And the New Hampshire Lottery Commission won round one of the federal district court lawsuit. A federal judge in New Hampshire entered judgment in favor of the New Hampshire Lottery. So what happens then? The Department of Justice, Bill Barr, takes an appeal of that ruling to the First Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. And several months ago, oral argument was held before a 3-judge panel in the First Circuit. We are anxiously awaiting the ruling based on that oral argument and all the briefing that preceded it. And honestly, it was considered to be imminent. I've been checking Pacer every day. We're in the period right now, several months after the oral argument, where a decision would have been forthcoming or expected. And what happened yesterday, one of the 3 judges hearing the case, First Circuit Judge Juan Turuella, passed away. He was the first Puerto Rican or first Hispanic judge to ever serve on the First Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, and the only Hispanic to ever serve on that bench. So it raises the question, what happens now? We have rules in the court system, in the federal rules of civil procedure, of what happens when a federal district court dies, what happens when a party dies, what happens when a lawyer becomes incapacitated. But there isn't any specific rule addressing what happens when a federal court of appeals judge passes while the decision that she heard argument on remains pending. And we believe it or not, there is a Supreme Court decision from 2019 unsigned that addresses this question and basically holds that if the other 2 judges, if the 2 surviving judges of the 3-judge panel are in agreement on the decision, you only need a quorum of judges to rule one way or the other. So on a 3-judge panel, a vote of 2 will carry the day. So if the 2 surviving judges are in agreement, you have a ruling. And the death of Judge Torello does not impact the decision. However, if those judges are not of the same view, one believes that the New Hampshire Lottery's ruling in their favor should be affirmed, and the other one might, side with a reversal of the lower court opinion. What would happen then is the First Circuit would probably have to assign a new panel or maybe just a 3rd judge to break the tie. It might lead to more oral argument. I don't think new briefing, but it dramatically slows the decision-making process and guarantees that this case will remain in abeyance when the next president is sworn in on January 20th, 2021, whether that's President Trump being reelected or Senator Biden or former Vice President Biden winning the election. And for a case that has really dramatic impact or could have a dramatic impact on the gaming industry, this is really a case that we're all watching. And it's the first time I've been around where a judge died during the pendency of the case. And one of the great lines, and I don't mean to diminish Judge Torello, who's obviously a pioneer for Hispanic judges nationwide, but one of the great lines in this Supreme Court opinion is that federal judges are appointed for life, not eternity.
So that's a very apt line. I think the big takeaway, and this will kind of bring us to our 4th topic. People that are maybe non-lawyers or outside the legal field always wonder what takes decisions so long to happen, why cases take so long. Obviously the cases that you and I touch upon, Dan, are in the sports realm, but judges on their docket have 99.9% of cases that maybe aren't newsworthy, right? That aren't drawing the same type of attention. So this case with the judge passing away in the pendency of the decision, it's obviously rare, right? Because how many judges die when they're sitting on the bench? Very few, but it's something, that people need to take into account. So Dan, this will bring us to our...
Well, they're appointed, just one final word, they're appointed for life, and many of them serve. Because they're appointed for life, there's no mandatory retirement age. And I clerked for a federal judge who was on the bench into his 90s. And that's kind of a common occurrence. And the passing of judges while on active duty or even senior status is more common, than we may appreciate. And because we only weigh in on these issues when they touch upon the sports industry, we're not as familiar with the identity of all these judges until it impacts a case that we're following. We all know most of the 9 Supreme Court justices, but very few of us can name, even a third of the judges in any federal circuit court of appeals.
Right. So I think that's a good place to put a pin in that. Obviously, we'll be monitoring that. And as for our last topic, again, Dan and I spent a lot of time talking about the Antonio Brown saga. We've dedicated plenty of airtime and breath to Antonio Brown. There hasn't been really a substantive update in his cases in some amount of time. There's still been a battle back and forth with discovery, but no depositions, anything like that. What has changed, Dan, is that Antonio Brown has signed a new contract. So Antonio Brown with the Pittsburgh Steelers was one of the, definitely on a Hall of Fame track, one of the best wide receivers in all of football. When he signed with the Raiders, still one of the best wide receivers in all of football. When he left the Raiders, in his brief time there, he went to the Patriots, had a big game for the Patriots, caught a touchdown from Tom Brady, and then was never seen foreseeable for the interim future. Now, Dan, last time we talked about Antonio Brown, I believe, was when he got his suspension. We were talking about how long the suspension was. But in any event, Dan, 8-week suspension. Week 9, he's supposed to suit up for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So I'm just going to read you. I know back in March, Bruce Arians, former coach of Antonio Brown, when he was with Pittsburgh, there's reports that those guys didn't get along there. And it didn't really surprise anybody when Antonio Brown was a free agent back in March. Bruce Arians was very clear, now the head coach of the Tampa Bay Bucs, that there was no room for Antonio Brown, that they were not interested in the Antonio Brown sweepstakes. Fast forward, Dan, that was March. We are now in November. Boy, how winning changes. Winning can change your attitude. And now, Dan, week 9, we're looking at Antonio Brown suiting up for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I will just give you a quote from Coach Arians, and I'll turn it over to you. Bucs coach Bruce Arians on the sexual assault allegations against Antonio Brown. Quote, "Let the court system do its job, period. If they're true, he won't be with us." And the only thing I'll add before I turn it over to you, what is the obvious statement that Bruce Arians should be saying is something along the lines of, right, innocent until proven guilty. But what Bruce Arians is saying is that if the court system adjudicates this case and determines that Antonio Brown has some guilt or some culpability, then we'll cut him. The problem, Dan, and this is why I think I like the order of our discussion today, the wheels of justice spin very slowly. There is no chance in what that this case is resolved before the Super Bowl. So I think this is a little bit of a technicality on Bruce Arians' part. What do you think?
This is the truth that so many civil attorneys know all too well. It's not that the wheels of justice spin slowly, but our cases are not the only ones pending before that particular trial court judge. Most, at least in Broward County, where Antonio Brown's civil lawsuit filed against him is pending, judges have a docket of probably several hundred cases. And, the time to go from the filing of a lawsuit to trial sometimes takes, close to 2 years. And when you throw in a pandemic and all the, issues and complications that are caused by, the inability to have in-person depositions and in-person court appearances, there's no chance that Antonio Brown's case will be adjudicated prior to the Super Bowl. But again, I want to stress he's already served a suspension. He's already been punished for all the items, all the issues that this case touches upon. And, what the only thing we're going to come to learn is whether a jury believes that it's more likely than not that these things occurred. And that doesn't really change anything. In the NFL, one of the dangers of suspending and disciplining players prior to an adjudication in a court system is, what if he wins the trial and a jury finds his accuser's allegations not credible and enters judgment or not liable in favor of Antonio Brown? Then what on earth was he suspended for?
But Dan, how about the other way? Let's say they convict him of rape and the details are much gorier than we know. Then I might tell you that 8-game suspension is not really that much, right? Like if someone is accused of rape and convicted of rape, maybe 8 games isn't really enough in that context. So I'm with you, but Dan, there has to be, as much as, we're just kind of both playing speculation, but innocent until proven guilty is still the standard in the country.
Dan, it's a civil case, not a criminal case. And no police report has ever been filed.
We'll say that is 100% true, but the burden is still on the plaintiff to prove her allegation. So in that sense, it's not necessarily innocent until proven guilty, but someone can't be presumed to be culpable for an event before the case really gets its wheels. But I think it's tough for Antonio Brown either way.
Yeah, but I've been following the case closely, even all these many months after his initial suspension, and he's still playing games and playing fast and loose with discovery in the court system. To this day, it doesn't appear as if he's produced so much as a single document in discovery. I was just checking the court docket earlier this week, and I saw Antonio Brown's response to a request for production of documents. Every single line item is objected to as irrelevant, outside the bounds of discovery. He has been, I would say, his behavior as a litigation party has been very obstructionist. He went a long period of time without even having a lawyer representing him, and he's basically thumbed his nose at the court system. So I think this is headed towards a plaintiff's verdict in all likelihood. I mean, he's gone through so many lawyers already, and the plaintiff's lawyer, I think, has been persistent throughout. But I don't think the news or what we learn about the case is going to get any worse than what's been alleged in the complaint. Usually the selling of the story and the allegations are going to be in the complaint. I don't think there'll be any new allegations here. We're now entering the moment of truth when a jury will weigh credibility. I don't think the story changes. I just think that there's some finality and maybe some sworn testimony under oath, if not in depositions, certainly in a trial setting. And those trials are open to the public. So I think there will be a fair amount of reporting on what Antonio Brown said or didn't say, but I still am of the belief that this is not going to go to trial, that this should have been settled a long time ago. And maybe it took a contract guarantee like this. If he earns his full guarantee, maybe that gives him a little bit more financial flexibility in which to pony up a reasonable settlement, because this case is not getting dismissed, and there's too much on the line for him to run the risk of having live testimony boomerang against him. And if it doesn't lead to a suspension, because I don't think the NFL is going to punish him twice for this, it could make him even more unemployable. So he needs to acquit himself not only on the field, but off the field, because if he doesn't, one or the other, this is going to be his last NFL season. Father Time is undefeated, and at his current age, I don't know if it's 32 or 33, he's already one of the oldest wide receivers in a game where the emphasis at these skill positions is on youth.
Yeah, I mean, the sad part is that Antonio Brown went from definitely, I think, first ballot Hall of Famer to just punching bag, and not without his own fault. I mean, he had definitely a number of different issues. So, again, I'm sure you and I could go on, which we have for Antonio Brown.
Well, lesson to be learned here. If you have a good thing going with the Pittsburgh Steelers, don't screw it up. Le'Veon Bell, Antonio Brown. I am sure that if they could travel back in time to 2017, both players would have comported themselves differently. And I am invariably on the side of players in disputes with management and coaching staff. I tend to see things through the lens of the players, but both players have really, I guess, engaged in self-inflicted harm and torpedoing what likely or what could have been Hall of Fame careers for both of them because of dissatisfaction with all these different issues, whether it was financial compensation or not seeing eye to eye with the quarterback or with the coach. I still can't believe that both players have screwed up their careers so immeasurably when they had such a good thing going with probably the most stable organization in the National Football League.
I think we can put a pin in Antonio Brown. Dan, I think, we're going to have to look forward to see what Antonio Brown does on the field. But, again, the courtroom is still going to really dictate how we view Brown's legacy. So with that being said, Dan, before we put this in the books, anything else to add for this week's episode?
No, I think it's been a pretty, non-dramatic week other than, on the field with the World Series. So I think that provides some, good closure for this week in sports law. And hopefully in another week or so, we'll have a decision in the Zion Williamson case and maybe some more fireworks in the area of sports law. And I can tell you, it never disappoints. There's always a new story or a new controversy. I'm looking forward to tackling some new material very soon.
Dan and I have 2, maybe 3 live podcasts scheduled to be on various law schools with law students and some attorneys in the near future, but we'll make sure to post the dates, be on the lookout for some dates in November. With that being said, Dan, I think we're ready to put this in the book. So Dan, as always, it can be found on Twitter and Instagram at Wallach Legal. Myself, Dan Lust, at Sports Law Lust. The show, Conduct Detrimental, at Con Detrimental. So for Dan and myself,
don't forget to vote early. Do not mail your ballot in. Drop it off in the basket at the polling center. I think this is the last episode we're going to release before Election Day. So everybody go out to vote, support your candidate, and remove any and all doubt by either voting in person or dropping off your mail ballot. I think we're a little bit too late in the game to mail it in, given the recent Supreme Court decisions. and all the political gamesmanship that's going on.
We'll see you next week, though. Dan, you said on another episode of
Conduct Detrimental, the Sports Law Podcast. We'll be back at it next week with a new episode. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys.